All right, folks, we have another separate news story here that I'd like to break off into a longer conversation, and that is about Microsoft, the Xbox brand, where they are right now, what they're planning on doing, and how that relates to the PlayStation business, and what we could see going into the next cycle, which, as we've said prior, like, yeah, it seems very soon, but that's only a few years away. And it's interesting, right? Because, we all have seen what's been well documented with Microsoft at this point, shipping 4 games on competing platforms, which even prior to that, with all their major acquisitions of what were previously a lot of third-party devs and publishers, the language was very careful of case-by-case basis and this, that, and the fourth. I don't want to sort of retread all the things we've already gone over during LTPS, but it's been well documented that it was, very gradual up until where we are right now, where we occasionally get these quotes left and right from either Sarah Bond or Phil Spencer, which has been slowly revealing that it's not just those 4 games. And that's the one aspect of the news we got this past week from Gamertag Radio. Very good conversation with Phil Spencer, also showing up on Destin's channel. And so it's the same thing. Phil shows up somewhere, he talks for a bit, and there's headlines left and right about the Xbox business, what they're planning on doing. And so honestly, it's getting to the point where, and I said this much like maybe a few weeks ago, a month ago or something on LTPS, but it's like this story keeps coming up. It's not really news at this point. So like the recent headline you probably all saw was again them admitting that they're going to be shipping their games on competing platforms. I mean, arguably this is the most open he's been at this point. So the one quote that's being thrown around here is where he says, and I quote, "We love our platform and our hardware, but we're not going to put walls up where people can engage with the great games our studios are building." So, again, we're seeing this Sega moment for the company. That's the other portion of it that's been like fairly well, I want to say documented, but it seems pretty clear from behind the scenes that the Xbox brand was given this okay to start investing like crazy. And there was a period between those post-acquisition games releasing and then where we are now, to where they had a little bit of leverage as far as exclusivity. And it was a more recent change of like, okay, we need to start seeing some better returns, and now we're going to be shipping on competing platforms. But having said that, the other aspect, which is a very big, valid question to ask, especially if you're primarily an Xbox customer and player, and you've got a gamer tag that's super old, and you've got all these achievements and digital software on there, why would you continue buying Xbox hardware? This was a valid question asked from Paris to Phil on the recent Gamertag episode. And so we have a quote here, and this is the quote I really want to focus on. So Phil says, and I quote, "I want people to pick hardware based on the capabilities of that hardware and how that fits into the choices that they want to make about where they want to play, and we want our hardware to win based on the hardware capabilities that we have." So he's more or less admitting that on the hardware side, we want to try and make a box that is the one you would pick, even though the other guy, and in this case we're talking about PlayStation, might be getting all of their games and then some, because PlayStation Studios is still a thing. They're not going away. So arguably, if you're a console buyer, why would you not just pick the box that has all the games that Microsoft is shipping and the additional studios from Sony? So you're going to be guaranteed those next God of War, Spider-Man, if Sony revisits Uncharted, whatever the case is, right? They've got obviously a treasure trove of IP that they're constantly exploring and apparently bringing some legacy IP back. And we all know why that is a really ideal scenario. And Sony is in a very privileged position here where we talk about it being a clear runway. They are not going to feel any pressure at all to ship on Microsoft, and they've never done that historically. They're very competitive, and they're also very traditional in that sense as far as what it means to be a console. They've been very conservative in that manner, and I don't really see that changing, despite them being a lot more lenient to a degree by exploring other platforms, other growth vectors. That's why they're doing PS productions and trying to do mobile, but failing miserably at it. Of course, live service, but also the PC releases. So they're conservative, but they're getting there. But it's not still to the point where they're going to start shipping on Xbox. But I digress. The point is, sorry, Melissa's walking near my keyboard. Please don't step on that. Point is, it's fascinating, right? I think that might be Phil almost admitting that we are looking to make a box that is sure, more powerful on paper, which we all know, generally speaking, that doesn't necessarily determine anything, because usually the most powerful box is not the one that ends up winning a console cycle by selling the most units. And at least in this environment with PS5 and Series X during this generation, we've seen that thanks to Digital Foundry, there's just a massive amount of examples that show the power difference, which, mind you, is not nearly as big as people like to make it seem. There was a bigger discrepancy between Xbox One and PlayStation 4 at that point, which that didn't stop people from buying Xbox One. So the point is, we've got a handful of examples where sometimes dev tools are what makes the PlayStation 5 version not only keep up with these Series X versions of certain games, but they're either matching that version, sometimes exceeding it. Obviously, there are many other cases, too, where it does swing in favor of Xbox, and that depends on the scope and scale of the game and what they're trying to accomplish. But it's clear that maybe Phil is implying that their next box is going to be something that goes above and beyond, which it's also fascinating to think about where we are with diminishing returns, because PS5, I think, is already a very good example of how Sony has acknowledged that. You've got the SSD, which it had this pitch initially of being a bit more open for developers, where it almost acts like a secondary pool of RAM. So there's a lot more that you can do as far as, sight lines and asset streaming and things like that. And we've seen certain games take advantage of that, but pound for pound, the SSD has been just a massive quality of life boost. It's not even necessarily something where it has to be a visual difference with the game or the experience that you're having in the moment. It could just simply be what we were all enjoying day one with this console, which is load times are basically gone. There's that. There's also the sensory experiences of PlayStation 5 that we can't overlook. The DualSense, the triggers, the haptics, 3D audio. That was already something that was pretty clear as far as how Sony tried to differentiate this generation from the outgoing one. And they've already openly acknowledged this with that recent PS5 Pro seminar, which is it's on them to make that distinction of, we won't do a new console cycle unless there are meaningful advancements in the space. And that would really sort of paint it as a proper PlayStation 6 and not some kind of half-step console. And that's not going to... They won't also not do those things in the interest of, let's say, a cross-gen period that we now expect is going to happen. So even though it's going to be 7 years, that's not going to stop them from doing PlayStation 6. But Sony has clearly defined PS5 in a manner that is outside of just strictly visual enhancements, because we are in diminishing returns. So I'm curious where Microsoft will go with this, because maybe they'll be very motivated here to put out a box that may very well have a high MSRP, and they'll just simply go for a low volume box that is meant to be on the pricier side, sure, but will have a meaningful power gap from, say, the next PlayStation console. And maybe that would be enough to sway people away from PlayStation Studio games. I think that would be a very tough sell. I'm not going to sit here and act like this is worrisome for Sony. I think they probably feel pretty good nowadays, given that what their closest competitor historically is now doing. But it's just, I guess, food for thought. It would be a really interesting thing if Microsoft takes this different approach into the next cycle. If they'll even maybe do a similar Series SX 2 SKU thing. Maybe they want to just go and build a really strong, powerful box that's maybe feeding into the low volume side. I don't know. I'm sort of really enjoying this conversation surrounding new hardware. It's always a fun thing, right? Because it's similar to the if you remember the crossplay debate of online games being closed ecosystems, and for a while Microsoft wanted to do it, Sony wanted to do it. It depends on the generation and which one they were leading in, because it's more beneficial to close it off if you're the one leading. So we know that's how it played out, and we see all the sort of dirty laundry Sony had behind the scenes with their cross-play clause and things like that. But the argument I always made back then is like, let's just open it up, let's let people play games where they choose to, and the way you sell your box is all these other things. In theory, you don't have to force online players into an ecosystem because that's where all their friends are. Maybe you could just win the customer off of genuinely good games, good hardware, accessible hardware if it's on the affordable side. So there is in this environment where we can play games, generally speaking, wherever we want, because there's so many different devices, remote play, cloud. Microsoft is clearly letting people play games anywhere, but for their hardware, it now becomes a game of, we're going to build a really compelling box, and that's why you'll play on our platform, which genuinely makes me think, okay, well, let's see it. I'd love to find out what they're cooking up on the Xbox hardware side. So it's just food for thought. I mean, I genuinely feel like Sony's in a position where they've got I don't want to say a super clear runway, but like they've got to feel good about where they are. To that point, I'll always remind people Sony is competing with not just Microsoft. It's always time. They want your time to be spent on PlayStation. So if you're watching Netflix, they consider that competition. If you're doing something that's not buying and playing on their products, they still have a due diligence and a job here to also make a compelling box and software that makes you want to spend all your time and money on their products and services. So they're in a really good spot, but they're not unchecked. I don't know. It's just something I thought was interesting to talk about, because really the software side, I mean, yeah, they keep saying they're going to ship games everywhere. That news to me is just old at this point, but hearing them talk more about like, okay, well, hardware-wise, here's what we're going to try and do to get you to still buy it in the face of us shipping on the competitor, that I think is now where it gets a lot more spicy and interesting, especially knowing too that we'll have handhelds come back from potentially PlayStation. It seems like that's likely going to happen, and Microsoft very much admitting that as well. So you've got this portable landscape happening, new consoles in about 2 years. It'll be fascinating to see it play out, that's for sure, and we'll be there to see it all happen as well. So anyway, thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. I'll see you all in my next video. You take it easy.